Welcome to this special episode of the HIO Show as we celebrate, and I guess that's the right word, the 25th anniversary of the Canadiens' last Stanley Cup championship, which came on June 9th, 1993, when they beat the LA Kings in Game 5 of the final at the Forum. I'm joined by my Gazette colleagues Jack Todd and Pat Hickey, Stu Cowan here, along with Julian McKenzie from CTV and Habs Eyes on the Prize, yes. And I think a couple other things also, but he's a busy young man. He wasn't even born the last time the Canadiens won the Stanley Cup, so he's here to give a perspective of a younger Canadiens fan. Anyway, 25 years, Jack, what's the main reason why this team hasn't won a cup since he was born?
Gary Bettman, it's all a league conspiracy from New York since they moved to New York. No, there are two reasons. The short term was the Patrick Roy trade, and just the hiring of Tremblay and Hulot. That was the most catastrophic decision, I think, maybe in the history of hockey, but certainly the Habs. It was a terrible call. They got in a weak GM and a hot-tempered coach with no experience, who hated Patrick Roy, and Patrick hated him. It was going to blow up very soon, and it did.
Well, Ronald Corey panicked, right? It was like 4 games into the season. Yeah. It's not like there was a lot of available people out there at the time. And you think Réjean was
if you were going to make a move, make it over the summer.
Over the summer, they were both.
But and he wiped out the entire brain trust. Carol Vadnais, Andre Boudria, the whole thing. And the Habs are still paying for it to this day. They never really caught up.
What do you think, Pat?
Well, I disagree. I think the team was on the way down before that. When Patrick Roy and Mike Keane were traded on December 7th, 1995, by that time, the Canadiens had only 4 players left from the team that won the Stanley Cup. That was 30 months afterwards. Now, you could say that would be all right if you had a bunch of old players, but this was one of the youngest teams ever to win the Stanley Cup. They had 13 guys under the age of 25. Patrick Roy was 26. J.J. Daigneault was 26. Kurt Muller was 26. This was a very young team. They should have been a dynasty for a couple of years, and they weren't. Now, since then, certainly what happened in '95 didn't help them, but this team was already in decline by then. Since then, the team has had to deal with the draft, the salary cap, different things that have hampered their effort, plus the fact they've had some incompetent management. Oh. And, so if you put all those things together, they really did have a chance. No Canadian team has won it. Part of that is because it's hard to attract free agents because of the tax reasons. But the tax is no different. The tax is probably higher in New York. Mm-hmm. And the Rangers have won a cup. There are all sorts of different factors, but it was just a combination. There were so many things that have gone wrong over the years.
So Julian, for a guy who wasn't born when they won it, what's
like, you're fine. We look at what happened 25 years ago and the team that was, but I can only draw on what's happened in the 2000s and the 2010s, and I've seen teams build winners, right? And the draft and the salary cap are a big reason why, but that hasn't stopped Pittsburgh and Chicago and LA from building these great teams, and they've won all those cups, right? So I think it's just a combination of the Canadiens not getting the right players to fit that mold. I think also certain decisions that management has done that's effectively taken the Canadiens out of contention at times. Remember they had the team in 2014 that made a really serious run, and only because Carey Price got hurt, they weren't able to make the final. That core that was there, that should be the team that should be competing, but unfortunately, it doesn't look as if we're going to be seeing that in the next few years.
Yeah, Pat mentions one thing of the draft, though, Pittsburgh went through some really lean years and got good draft picks. And, so that helps a little bit.
I don't know how much of the Canadiens it's the drafting or the developing, because the
development, absolutely.
I think it's a combination of both. What you start off is players that aren't very good, and you have people that haven't really done a good job of helping them get better. Yeah. And that's a dual problem there.
All right, Jack, I'm not going to ask how old you were when they won the Cup, but what's your lasting memory of that playoff run? There were so many magical moments. Is there one that stands out in your mind?
Actually, it was the stick measurement. When they had to measure McSorley's stick, it was a strange move, but at that moment, all the momentum was going the wrong way, and they would have had to go back to LA. I think the whole series could have turned on that. And I remember watching and waiting for what the result was going to be, and somebody had a very sharp eye.
Well, it
there.
was Guy Carbonneau. I spoke with Guy Carbonneau recently about it for some feature stuff we're doing on the 25th anniversary, and he didn't admit it was him, but he said he was one of the guys, and he was talking about how the players would change their stick. The Canadiens had a rule in the last 10 minutes of the game, if you had an illegal stick, you had to go to a legal one, and he said McSorley didn't, and he noticed it, but as he said, he credited Jacques Demers for having as he said, the balls to make that call.
Yeah.
Not only the call, but then he pulled the goalie, too, for a 2-man advantage with 1 minute and 45 seconds left, and Eric Desjardins scored to tie it.
Is that rule still in effect?
And then scored again in overtime. I don't believe it is.
Yes,
I think
it is.
That's a weird
but it's a
rule.
bigger curve now, right?
It is a bigger curve, but
You never see
and
it
nobody
anymore.
calls it. You know,
Yeah.
it's just, and even in those days, I mean, several players I talked to said it was not uncommon for that rule to be called.
Mm-hmm.
It was a fairly new rule at the time, and the coaches thought they could take advantage of it. Several players said that Carbo was the guy. They also identified Luc Robitaille, who had an illegal stick, and but one of the players was saying, you know, Carbo was so smart, and as a centerman, he was looking at these sticks all the time, and he was always looking for any edge he could get, and that's what made him good in the face-off circle. Was that he was always looking for an edge one way or the other. They say that the best face-off guys are the guys who cheat.
Yeah.
And but they're the guys that look for that edge.
Carbonneau told me that McSorley is still upset with him about that. He talked about it a couple of times. I remember Patrick Roy's wink. Remember the wink in the game in LA? Who was that he made the save on? It was
McSorley.
no, it wasn't McSorley. It was Sam.
I can't remember.
So long. That
Sundstrom
shows you how
or
long ago it
Sundstrom?
was.
Yeah.
None of us
Was it
can-
Sundstrom?
Yes, it was Sundstrom.
Sundstrom,
The young guy remembers. Thankfully, we have somebody with a good memory here. We're talking about Patrick Roy. Pat, does he get too much credit for that Stanley Cup victory?
I think he gets the kind of. I think anybody that says it was just Patrick Roy gives him too much credit. Patrick Roy lost 5 games. I think he lost
His last 5 starts.
His last 5 starts
Of the regular season.
And he lost the first 2 games of the series. There were people suggesting he was through, that they should start Andre Rasico in Game 3.
Andre Red Light Rasico.
But Patrick came back and played really well. But you look at that team, and there were a bunch of guys nobody knew at the time. But they went on to have, Danfus and Muller and Brian Bellows were the top 3 scorers, were all guys that everybody knew. But you look at the defensemen, Patrice Brisebois was 21, had a long career. Matthew Schneider was 22, had a long career. Sean Hill was 22. Lyle Oderline was 24. Eric Desjardins was 22. These are guys that all had really long, successful careers. Unfortunately, most of them with other teams.
Yeah, well,
and so they had they had a team. Oleg Petrov, who was a very handy player, couldn't get into the lineup. He only played 9 games that year for the Canadiens. He played 1 game in the playoffs, and the ultimate insult was he didn't get his name on a Stanley Cup.
That's right. Well, Carbonneau talked about how underrated that defense was. And he also mentioned guys like Gilbert Dion and Paul DiPietro, guys who sort of came out of nowhere and played a big role. Jack, does one of those guys stand out to you?
Yeah, Gilbert Dion. Pointing at himself.
Pointing at.
I think DiPietro was more important. He was one of those guys. That was his career in the NHL. Just about. I think it was the next year, my first year on the beat anyway. When mild-mannered Jacques Demers lost it with DiPietro to the point where he threw all his equipment in the whirlpool. So he could drive a coach nuts, but that playoff he was superb.
Paul DiPietro was traded 2 years later for a 4th-round draft pick.
That's right.
Now he went on. The 2 highlights of Paul DiPietro's career: he scored 8 goals in the playoffs. He had mono earlier in the year and didn't join the team until January. So he had a late start for the season, but he certainly hit his stride in the playoffs. The other highlight in his career was at age 35. He scored both goals as Switzerland beat Canada 2-0 at the Turin Olympics. And those are the 2 highlights of his career.
Here's something for Julian. This might surprise you. I don't
Okay.
know if you've looked at the 93 roster. Just how many French Quebecers were on that team? Just going down the list here quickly. Danfus, Lebeau, Savard, Dion, Eric Desjardins, Patrice Brisebois, Benoit Brunet, J.J. Daigneault, Guy Carbonneau, Mario Roberts, Jesse Belanger, Donald Dufresne, Patrick Roy, Andre Rasico. Does it surprise you to think that there was a time when there was that many French Quebecers?
I have to say, yeah, and we were talking about just off air. There's not as many of French Canadian players in the game right now, but I think that's really surprising to see. And before anyone thinks, is John Leclerc on that list? He's not Quebec, just so everyone knows. Yeah, no, but back once upon a time, the whole ton of French Canadian players were dominating the league in the 70s, obviously, and even in the 90s as well. Patrick Roy, obviously, being atop that list. So, yeah, that is surprising to see that many players kind of dominated the Canadiens roster.
All right, one more for you. Good question for you. What's the best moment for the Canadiens since 1993?
You know what's funny? I remember talking to people about this, my age, for a story I was writing for the Gazette. And a lot of people either brought up the Saku Koivu return game from cancer, and they brought up the 2010 run. And I know I mentioned the 2014 run where the Canadiens went to the conference final, and that was a pretty good team. But there's something about that 2010 run where they upset the President's Trophy Capitals. They ended up upsetting the Pittsburgh Penguins. There was something about that team and how impossible of a run that was, and how ridiculous everything was, and everyone going outside and celebrating each win outside the Bell Center and all that. It was something about that run that was just so magical and so fun that everyone, especially my age, was just really enjoying and really getting into. So a lot of people remember that 2010 run, and that stays with them forever. I know it'll stay for me forever, just watching all that. I remember I was in high school when that happened, and I think I was in high school. Sorry, I don't mean to make everybody old, but I remember that happened, and I was working for this high school play that was happening. I think I was like an assistant stage manager, and Game 7 was happening as we were doing a show, and I couldn't watch the game. I was like working backstage, and this friend of mine is calling one of the cast members on his cell phone, and we're listening in, and we're all trying to figure out, what's the score? It's like 1-0. This was before Dominic Moore scores, and he scores, and then we're all just like running around backstage, and they start counting down the final seconds to Game 7, and it's over. And that was like the biggest thing for everybody, because remember, we've never seen a Stanley Cup. We've never seen anything big like that in our lives. We were supposed to lose that series in 5. I think, I'm trying to remember if one of you guys might have even predicted the Canadiens were going to lose the series in 5. I think it might have been you, Pat.
It might have been.
It might have been you.
It might have been.
Yeah, no, it's weird.
I stopped predicting after I predicted that the Habs were going to beat New Jersey in '97, and I was so roasted for that I never made another prediction.
Here's an interesting thing. I mean, they lost to Philadelphia.
Yeah, they got overworked in that series.
Well, they also got beat by a hot goaltender who had been a Canadian at one point, Michael Leighton. And
for like 2 seconds.
And for about 2 seconds, yes. And Michael Leighton, for example, after that game, he played exactly 4 games in the NHL.
Wow.
After that series, after the playoffs that year.
2010 was also our first introduction of PK Subban. I remember he went on
Yeah.
that run during that period.
Played like 2 regular season games, and then all of a sudden he gets that big role in the playoffs. That's when fans really started to love PK Subban. He made himself known, and people said, you know what? We got to get behind this kid.
All right.
PK Subban went to Washington. They didn't have a stall for him.
That's right. He
And
changed the garbage can.
Wow.
He had to change. He sat on a folding chair, and there was a garbage can right next to him. Guys were always throwing stuff over him.
Jack, what could this current edition of the Canadiens learn from that 1993 team, do you think?
That you're never down, no matter what kind of. Patrick Roy was coming off a worse season than Price had this year, and yet they won the Stanley Cup. You know, if you come together at the right time, things can happen. Given a certain level of talent, I don't think they're there now, but a few additions, the right situation comes up again. If you still have Price, it's always a maybe.
I know Guy Carbonneau talked about the role Jacques Demers played and just how positive an influence he was. And he said he thinks he's the most positive man he ever met. And he said part of that might have to do with the fact he was illiterate, but at the time they didn't know that.
Yeah.
And he said the fact that he had to cover that up. And I think Kirk Muller talked to you, Pat, about the speech he made before Game 1 of the final. And he said, this is when we separate the men from the boys. So let's go, boys.
It's a Pat Burns team, really.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think it worked out just right. You had the negative guy who was always up there, Keister, gone, and the really positive guy came in with the system that Pat had put in and won a cup with him.
Yeah, I think, I was talking to Kirk Muller, and he was saying that everybody learned to play defense when Burnsy was there.
Yeah.
And he said and then when Jock came in, loosened everything up a little bit, but then they pulled back in the second half of the season when they realized they had to get a little better for the playoffs. They also made 2 key additions that year, Dan Foose and Brian Bellows. And they were 2 of their top 3 scorers. Muller had arrived the year before, so their top 3 scorers were relative newcomers to the team.
Well, 25 years later, it wasn't just Patrick Waugh. It was a pretty good hockey team that won the Stanley Cup for the Montreal Canadiens. Well, thanks for watching this special edition of the HIO Show as we look back on the Canadiens' last Stanley Cup championship in 1993, 25 long years ago. Please share your thoughts and comments in the comment section below the video. We'll be back again on June 27th to discuss what happens at the draft in Dallas. Pat Hickey will be at the draft. And we'll be back again on July 4th to discuss all the free agency moves that are done on July 1st, whether John Tavares does in fact come to Montreal, if that's even a possibility. Until then, have a safe summer, enjoy the sun, and have fun.